Welcome to Paradigm Mall, Chapter 1. The game started in total darkness, no one remembering how they got there. Some participants retained a few items, like I with her pipe, but others like John woke up without their blender. What was consistent, though, was that nobody had their phone, and when people like Susan, Lilith, and Akiara checked their notebooks, everything they wrote within the past 2 weeks was torn out. There was something, though. Vega had strange syringes in his pocket, contraband he couldn't let anyone know about. Suddenly, the lights blasted on, revealing everyone was in an 80s disco room. Down from a disco ball descended a little kid with blue hair and gray skin known as Calix, the apprentice, with an even littler ant on their shoulder named Shu. These were the hosts, the ones responsible for running the show. They introduced the game excitedly, announcing that the participants would die game by game until 3 remained, and that those who were surviving would get the ultimate treasure. Calix was childish and sadistic, taking joy in being center stage, but upset that others weren't as excited as they were. It was as if they didn't understand the value of human life. The ant, on the other hand, was very quiet and modest, shy whenever made to speak, and uncomfortable in the limelight. The first game was to be Game of Stakes and Blood, a take on Vampire. The mall was strange and unfinished. It was like it was straight out of the 80s, except several rooms were rotting and felt wrong to enter for extended periods of time. Still, people explored the area head to toe for an escape. Though there were windows, all you could see outside was a starry night with no landscape in sight. A strange void. The stars never moved, and the sun would never rise. When Vega, I, and Susan went to investigate the window, Susan fell to her knees when prepared to break it open. This was the first time the sanity mechanic was triggered. Sanity, later to be known as infection level, was how much Shu's influence was able to capture a given person. But the more a participant bore witness to divine events, dwelled in infested/rundown areas, experienced stressful events, or was bit by another infected participant or Roziours, the sicker and sicker they would get. There were 5 stages, the end stage being fully transformed. The participants also weren't from the same years. Most were from 2023, but one was from 2022, and some even as far as 2040. How this was possible was unknown, but it seemed this paradigm just transcended space and time. A new host was run into when looking for runes. Epiphane. He was a blind human-like being, also with gray skin and blue hair. He was called the Butler. Personality-wise, he was very tempered and modest, smiling and ready to serve the participants at any given moment. The humanoid hosts were creatures called Roziours, cold to the touch and physically extremely strong, yet mentally fragile. Supposedly there were more than just Epiphane and Calix, but those had yet to be met. Immediately, the participants got to meddling and ended up already breaking the rules by entering vents. Shu came along to chastise the cast, but nobody ended up being punished. Apparently she had lifted the rules from someone else and forgot to modify them, and so explore people did. One group stumbled into the Roziours' residence where they found where they slept and their clothes. The only thing out of place was a locked box Calix had and a long blue strand of hair with no origin. Through the other tunnel Tiel pursued, something blocked her from continuing, with a voice telling her to go back. Weeks into the future, the participants would learn that this vent led into the boiler room, a place that she dare not enter for it was too hot. Once in a while, loud banging noises would reverberate from within the furniture store. After finally deciding to confront the chaos, the next Roziours was revealed. Demon, a bright, happy, muscular man who seemed especially friendly and fond of the cast. He was extremely tall and physically impressive, and he was called a technician. His job was to repair, build, and serve as Shu's muscle. Currently, he was trying to fix up the decaying rooms. It was as if the setting for the game was only half finished when it started. It was rushed. The final Roziours wouldn't be seen until the first game ended, but one person found her. Lilith ran into the record keeper, seeing that she was examining his book that he brought in, one that belonged to Sloane Kane, his father, a person of interest. The record keeper was the one responsible for tearing out pages of people's books, but upon realizing that this book wasn't Lilith's after all, wanted to confiscate it. The record keeper refused to go by a different name, since Shu wasn't the one who named the Roziours, but Demon. It seemed she had pretty severe beef with him. Roles were given out for the next game. I was the vampire, whilst Cho and Goro got to be vampire hunters. All 3 died in the trial after an amazing play by I, with only an unlucky guess from a hunter being able to take her down. Cho relished in the chaos, even as death approached, and Vega sobbed over his boyfriend dying. Epiphane was the one to quickly kill the vampire hunters. William achieved immunity for 2 games because he was the most senior vampire to live with I dead. Chapter 2. Upon exiting the building, the scenery completely changed. Instead of an 80s mall, it was a two-story mall that seemed to have been taken right out of the 90s. Rooms were still in disrepair, and the bedrooms had been rearranged in such a way that the deceased were no longer included. How people moved here was a complete mystery. The next game was going to be Game of Cloak and Dagger, a take on Mafia. A majority of this fragment remained unexplored, with events never being poked into. People continued to get sick and started to affect a few people's sanity. Demon at this point became a closer friend and ally, though he had some pretty serious issues that had long gone unaddressed. However, Akiara discovered a strange lab in the back of the pharmacy with extremely strange information held within. Somebody named Sybil was experimenting with god juice that had the ability to heal the sick decades ago, but was far too potent and difficult to be made into pill form to distribute widely. After slipping, Akiara accidentally received a dosage, and just like that, his symptoms disappeared, only left with a looming sense of dread. Sybil was Vega's quote-unquote aunt, meaning he had some strange ties to this game. Vega's father had a patch of skin akin to Sybil, who had skin similar to a head he had in his attic, who had similar skin tone to the Roziours. Strange indeed. Iwa began poking her head around the lab and experimenting on her own, attempting to use Sybil's research to form a pill that could serve as an ultimate cure. The situation escalated out of control as half the cast showed up due to the noise. Iwa stormed off to her room with the vials and thus descended Shu, who in exchange for body parts would give Vega and Akiara more information and some of the vials back. Demon performed surgery on Vega. Shu, happy with the donation of body parts, for sure confirmed that it was Sybil indeed who was related to these events. After Demon apologized to Vega and made up, he soon was able to share his memories with the cast more. The Roziours were actually reanimated Roziours. Roziours were homunculi that had been created by a robot named Coil. The Roziours were Kyriakos, Icarus, and Inara, Sybil, and Chrysanthus. He'd made hundreds, but only these few were successes. Whilst Demon was one of the very few Roziours that could maintain its form, Coil discarded him because he was far too kind. The other Roziours were mastering the corpses of other failed Roziours, never having woken up at all. Realizing he was named Demon by Coil, because that's what he wanted him to be, Demon began to fall into a depression because names meant everything to him. The next game started with Iwa, John, and Damon as the Mafia. They managed to kill Octavian, Mia, and then Lilith. The towns drowned, whereas the two Mafia who got caught faced a different fate. Iwa had a hole punched through her chest by Demon, which Demon had no control over. His body was possessed by Shu. When pressed why do this, she said nostalgia, and that she's seen it done before. Shu was lifting notes from Coil's game, as well as the bodies of the literal Roziours, the rules, and the very idea of the death game itself. Her tie to the previous game, though, was still very much unknown. When Damon got caught, instead of having his heart punched out, he stomped on Shu, the first one having to do so. After a chorus of laughter, from under his foot an insurmountable amount of ants emerged, overwhelming him. They sent him to a wall as roots emerged, holding on to him as if he was crucified. A sharp root then emerged from the center of his chest, killing him, before turning the cross upside down. The record keeper cried over Lilith's death, devoting herself to hatred and blaming John. Chapter 3. The new mall held remnants of the 70s, but unlike the first malls, they were fully finished and held no signs of decay. Though they were pristine, it wasn't because they were touched up by Demon, but because they were actually brought from the 70s with no complications from Shu that required touch-ups. If she pulled participants from points in time, it was possible these rooms were pulled from across time as well. It didn't seem she had utter control over it though, since if it was possible for her to get them pristine all the time, then none of the rooms would have been run down, meaning she pulled rooms that were built in the 80s from a later point in time like the 2020s. The 70s, though, were pulled from the 70s. However, where she was getting these rooms from was unknown. The game of Fear and Loathing was announced, a take on Your Turn to Die. Vega lost the ability to hear Shu, and when she bit him trying to reestablish infection, she died. Vega was vaccinated by somebody before the game, and it seems to have protected him entirely from getting sick, perhaps related to the syringes found in his pocket. Together with Elio, they dissected the dead ant and found it was a conjuration woven together by small roots with a strange spore inside. Upon slicing the spore, a gloomy church bell could be heard within the heads of all participants except Vega. These bell noises were also notable during games, unexplained sounds only within the head. Shu didn't communicate via sound at all, but through infecting others and invading their minds. Shu was a divine fungal deity. That explained the infections, her control over the paradigm, and the way she dominated the minds of ants to do her bidding. Where she got her divinity from, though, was unknown. It seems she was a rather new being, hence why she was so quiet and nervous at the start of the game and developed a personality further along. The Glaziers were much the same way, young. They were only assembled a few weeks to months before the start of the game. Susan also remembered a pharmaceutical company, Ouroboros Line Industries, a place she was investigating shortly before her kidnapping. It was ran by a man named Kay Kuttner, whose lineage had owned the company for decades. He was sick, extremely sick, and was responsible for infecting many of the people who went into this game, and also vaccinating Vega. He told her that he was a divine being, able to risk his sanity to divine answers from the universe, something he achieved through a slumbering god. Something recently had happened to this slumbering god, and it was wrapped up in this infection he and now Susan were going to experience. Shu kidnapped people for 3 reasons. People related to the people of the events of Slumbering Shrine, so Coil's game, those who had her infection as she didn't intend for it to escape her paradigm, so she was reining them back in, and randoms to keep the game spicy. There was a reason Kuttner wasn't kidnapped. Those who had a specific strain of divinity were considered the same being to some extent, and not foreign bodies. Akiara wasn't being wholly cured because the infection wasn't registered as a foreign entity. The infection unintentionally crept across the line of divinity, which also included the corpse of Chrysanthos, who perhaps wasn't as permanently dead as others thought. Chrysanthos was a Roziours made by Coil that was exposed by unfiltered divine knowledge, which broke their brain. They were only barely able to grasp onto sanity, and even in death, it haunted them. This also explains why Shu didn't know of Kuttner or Chris being infected. It was unintentionally spreading through the divine line, and her divinity doesn't register them as beings since it's a shared pool. She still doesn't know this. The drama between all the Glaziers was finally revealed. Shu made the architect, by far the smartest and most talented Glazier, who helped her make the paradigm. The record keeper and the technician were made next. The 3 were very close, all this being a few months before the game. The day after a new Glazier was introduced, the technician and the architect got into a heated discussion. This ruined the technician's mood, and he carelessly started augmenting the paradigm while working, accidentally cracking open a seal. This is why you don't break the window. You die. The architect saved the technician as an explosion occurred, scarring the technician and killing the architect alongside the newborn Glazier. The technician tried stitching what remained to revive the architect, but a new Glazier entirely woke up, the one that became the butler. This caused the record keeper to loathe the technician, never working together again. Shu, seeing the best Glazier dead, tried pushing Demon to assume the title of inventor, but he was convinced he was never going to be good enough. Not getting anywhere, Shu last minute created the last Glazier, the apprentice, the one meant to assume the role of the architect once they grew up and be Shu's co-host. Though titles were important, they were impersonal, so the technician, who was Demon, named the butler Epiphane and the apprentice Calyx, names that Shu would never use and the record keeper refused to take on. Demon was left with the feeling he was a monster and would never be good enough. Record keeper with nothing but hatred and apathy in her heart. Epiphane with an identity problem for who he really was, and Calyx a massive responsibility to wield, and not one of them was over 3 months old. Shu didn't really care though. Speaking of Calyx, as the game progressed, the less they seemed to enjoy it. They were supposed to be having fun, but people dying wasn't as great as Shu made it seem it would be. Even worse, they kept getting rapidly older as the game progressed, reflecting how responsibilities were also getting more and more important for them to hold up. Responsibilities they didn't want. It no longer seemed like they were a co-host. They didn't want to be. The time for the game came with Akiara, John, Elio, Susan, Alice, and Matthias getting voted up. John was the one voted to die, and Alice was the sacrifice. Alice decided they wanted to be crushed, and thus Demon was the one forced to carry it out. John was going to be electrocuted with a whole torture system ready to be implemented by the record keeper, but Teal ended him quickly instead. This greatly angered the record keeper since she blamed John for Lilith's death, but before she could attack Teal, Demon knocked her out, Calix was heartbroken. The people they cared about most had all died, and Alice was the last straw for them. They were mad at the game, the participants, and Shu. Shu, after the game ended, collapsed, and Demon picked her up before freezing in place. She had been getting more and more exhausted after each game, which was later shown to be because she exerts a massive amount of energy reshaping her paradigm when it comes to moving everyone around different malls and opening the game room where these death games were being played. Chapter 4. With Shu passed out, the mall was never changed to a different decade. It was the same as the previous. When Shu was able to move around again, though still exhausted, she announced the next game. However, Calix barged into the room having stolen one of the contraband syringes Vega had at the beginning of the game. Antibodies against Shu's infection. With Shu weak, Calix injected her with it and assumed control of the game, slyly stealing her divinity. It seems that Shu's form of divinity was not hers. She took it from somewhere, and that means that others can risk stealing it from her too by risking their sanity. You can become successful like Kuttner, or broken like Chrysanthus. However, unlike Kuttner, Shu had far more control than just divining answers. The fungal aspect was something entirely belonging to her, just emboldened by more power. Why she had fungal powers was unknown. With Calix in charge, finally having assumed the role of an architect, they sent others down into this kids section of the mall where they could launch constant minigames onto the participants to whittle them down. The Roziours hid, recording Epiphane, almost entirely missing the entire time, and Demon found just once, his self-loathing increasing more and more as he blamed himself for what happened to the participants. Though everyone thought Iwa died earlier, it was real to have actually been Jin, as Iwa encouraged the two to swap in order to save herself, and, in order to try and escape responsibility, started calling herself an entirely new person, Eos. Though the game announced was the game of sentimentality and treachery, it was now the game of pride and pretend. The first game was called Squares, and Benjamin sacrificed himself so Elio wouldn't have to die, going out on his own way to not let Calix have control. The second game was called Tag, and Eos, or rather Iwa, was the last left it. Organic material burst forth from her back and became a beautiful mushroom the size of a tree, killing her. The last game was called Maze, and an animatronic wolf burst forth too early, killing Sandrine. The remaining were split up into two, above and below. The ones above faced things called white blood cells, with scribbles drawn all over them. They had to evade these monsters, answer their riddles, and Ace sacrificed his life to fight one off for the others. They also came across the Roziours graveyard, the parts Shu was originally sourcing from to make new Roziours. Lastly, the group managed to collect a lot of treasure in general. The ones below dealt with the dark maze as they were constantly tracked down by the wolf animatronic as they hid, ran, and stunned it. They came across a pro animatronic that also confronted them with riddles, and then right after achieved a means of reviving a dead participant, reunited Goro with Vega. But he was blue like a Glazier and held the strength of one too. The last animatronic they met was the Doe, who managed to see past the cannon and had a strange bow tie with a peculiar symbol on it. It crushed Susan and tore off her arm, but it was stabbed by Vega onto its bow tie after Elio seemed to alter fate to let it happen. Immediately fainting right after having done so, the Doe screeched so loud it shook the entire mall, yet somehow didn't destroy everyone's eardrums, a divine wail that alerted something. Either way, Susan had the god juice splashed onto her to prevent her from dying, and the cast managed to escape. Both groups reunited and saw Calix, who was fuming. Calix had constructed all these games to wipe out the participants, not expecting them to live. TL and William rushed Calix, throwing them off guard, and suddenly Shu re-emerged, stealing back her power. Somehow, she survived. Now, remember how I said Elio altered fate? Well, since Chapter 1, this little kid had been befriending the main host, becoming her brother figure. She became more childish due to his encouragement and less cooperative with his advice. In turn, she made Elio her disciple, and helped him reach a lesser role of divinity, giving him the chance to retry fate at the cost of risking his brain from snapping. When the core of Shu that was stabbed started to wither, she escaped by hiding in Elio's mind, something he allowed her to do. Due to Elio's benevolence, she gathered her strength and was able to make a full comeback. After Calix begged for forgiveness, Shu snatched away the safety net of protecting Calix's ego, exposing them to the brutal truth of everything ever. The same thing that happened to Chrysanthus, but worse. They caved and became a husk of themselves. Then, as if nothing had happened, she returned everyone back to Paradigm Mall, the very first one they started in. Whilst the cast dreaded a new game announcement, it never came. Without the sun ever rising, it became harder and harder to tell time as Shu stopped making announcements. She almost disappeared entirely. The lights outside of the window seemed to start going out slowly, these stars disappearing. When Tiel pressed her head against the window, she heard whispers, though couldn't discern who they belonged to. Something was happening inside the paradigm, or perhaps outside of it. She would only swing by if her name was called, hardly present over her own game. She stressed she was busy, but busy with what? Elio finally reached stage 5 of Shu's infection and became a pseudo-glazier like Goro, now having blue hair and gray skin alongside the strength of one too. Others, like Susan, drew closer. However, Vega didn't have any infection at all, and folks like William were still in the early stages. When Shu was back, often it was for trades. At the start of the game, she seemed perturbed by people offering their body parts. But now she did a complete 180. Now it seems all she's interested in is body parts. Since everyone was free, some moved to find Demon again, only to realize that he had died once they broke into the boiler room, the one place Shu dare not enter. He never confronted his self-loathing issues and decided to tear himself apart in order to build a new, more capable Glazier, able of accessing his intellect, the inventor. This new Glazier was named Adam, and he was eager to learn more about the participants to determine if he should help them, but was met with a cold response. There was some motive for him to help, though. If Shu found out about Adam's existence, she could kill him. So he invented the Chaos Spikes, devices that would temporarily purge her presence from an area, so people could talk or exist in spaces she wouldn't see. They would also serve as perfect weapons against the Glazier, since they are only able to exist via Shu's will, so dispersing it would kill them. The Roziours can function outside of their game, but the Glaziers can't. Their very existence hinges on the infection Shu provides them that holds their bodies together. Though Shu wasn't paying attention to where her Glaziers were since she didn't care about them, what she was aware of was the amount. Since people liked Demon more than Adam, and he knew this, he suggested that he could try to bring Demon back via his own rib by killing Elio, therefore still having the same amount of Glaziers active at the same time as they continued to dismantle her empire. Some participants seemed on board for this. However, Elio had a falling out with Shu. Shu had trusted him with a lot of information and seemed to almost want Elio to tell others facts, except for one, not to say who she really was. However, in a conversation, he revealed to Susan privately her most held secret, and as a result, was severely punished. She announced she wanted him dead, and the rest of the cast, knowing that he was an enemy of Shu, decided that they actually didn't want him dead after all. She tried giving Elio another chance, but Elio finally broke things off with her, and then he proceeded to have some really weird dreams, as he no longer was having his hand held by her. Susan and Akiara, on different occasions, when using the Chaos Spike, pressed too hard and not just shifted Shu's energy away, but saw past her paradigm. There, they were temporarily greeted with a woman with gray skin and long pink hair with eyes that matched the ones of the bow tie on the doe. She didn't seem pleased, vowing to kill the participants who were pathogens when she found them. Though she may resemble a Roziours on the surface, it was clear she was far more. Akiara was soon after found dead, having done too many risky things in reaching stage 5 of the infection. He attempted to tear out his spore, but very quickly died right after, which showed what would happen to the Glaziers if they attempted to escape Shu's influence. Some of the cast tried helping Adam build something called the Paradigm Shifter, but as the days passed, insecurity was introduced into his heart too. He felt out of place here, like he couldn't do anything right, and that somebody else could help the participants more. Without Elio dead, and no one to experiment on for a cure to turn the Glaziers into Roziours again, Adam used himself as a test subject. He successfully made a cure for the Glaziers, but his failed prior attempts was killing him, so he used a part of himself to try to recreate Demon, leaving an infant behind. It was too soon to tell if it was Demon or not, but Tiel and Vega were kind enough to give him a name, Data. And thankfully, this child had streaks of pink hair. Tiel was left with now 3 things: a baby, vows for curing infection, and Adam's rib. Just like how Chrysanthos might be able to be revived, Adam hoped maybe, someday, it would be possible for him too, even though he wasn't part of the divine line at all. Finally, something happened, and that was Record Keeper and Epiphane taking over for the next game. They announced a game of reminiscence and acuity, trivia, that they would host whilst Shu continued to be busy. And that's all the summary that's needed. I know it's a lot, but that's what you need to know. Yay! Thank you for listening.